And I had the pleasure of being part of an evening with Anne Alvarez last night, hosted by the Australian Psychoanalytic Association. I noted that there was 104 participants, but very few were willing or able to ask questions at the end. And I thought maybe it was because the material was quite dense and maybe it was hard for them to have the confidence to ask questions. I'm sure there were many child psychoanalytic psychotherapists listening, but I think none of us had the courage to ask questions of Anne. So the topic was reclaiming psychic life, clinical approaches to empty states, and how to vitalize a patient. So I'm going to attempt to do this little video to help metabolize and digest what I think we were hearing about last night, to help my colleagues and supervisors understand, I think, the importance of what Anne Alvarez is talking about. It was a very rich paper, and Anne, I think, poses a challenge to the traditional Kleinian assumptions about projective identification, withdrawal, and for a therapist, one's analytic neutrality. And she's suggesting that we need a different way of understanding our clients who appear empty, passive, psychologically dead, or have been severely neglected. So Anne has been part of the Tavistock child psychotherapy training. She's written books on Life Company and the Thinking Heart. And a case of hers that she had in her talk called Robbie, I think, is very well known. So the central thesis that I think Anne is putting across, and I don't wish to speak for Anne, but this is my take on it, is that not all psychological emptiness is defensive. And I think that it often can be interpreted. So traditional psychoanalysis often assumes that the withdrawal of a patient is defensive, that meaningful parts of the self are projected into the analyst, and that the analyst contains these projections and verbally interprets them. While I think Anne Alvarez is really saying that with profoundly deprived, autistic, or traumatized patients, there may be very little self to project in the first place. So instead of withdrawing, these clients have given up. Instead of hiding behind defenses, they're actually psychologically lost. So that then means that there has to be a distinction in how we technically work with these clients, and it has to be dramatically different. And I think that's been the brilliance of Anne Alvarez with her work. So the theoretical development, like she was telling us last night, that Freud sort of explored the passions, sexuality, jealousy, conflict, and repression. And then we have Melanie Klein, and she shifted our attention to guilt, envy, reparation, the depressive position, and the concept of internal objects. So then we have Winnicott, who helped us understand and get into play, creativity, the concept of the true self, developing a capacity to be alone. Winnicott was followed by Bion's ideas, and I think Bion seems very important to Anne Alvarez. So he proposed that thinking develops from emotional experience. He talked about the alpha function, the container contained, and K, which is like the wish to know. So here comes then Anne Alvarez. What's her main contribution? So what she is saying is that psychoanalysis has concentrated too much on, say, passion, but not enough on the absence of passion, or I would probably use the word aliveness within a client. So some patients evoke in us boredom, emptiness, lifelessness, deadness, hopelessness. And, we just can't reach them, it seems. So, and traditionally, the psychoanalyst would say, the patient has projected his vitality into you. And Alvarez is going, I don't think so. She instead says, what if there isn't much vitality available to project? Which is a radical theoretical move, because she's really saying, what if there is not yet aliveness in your client? So then she talked last night about Robbie, a seminal case, which she uses to illustrate her learning. So unlike Tustin and Tustin's autistic children, Robbie was not defended. He was not hidden. He seemed what she calls lost. And Alvarez writes, he was undrawn rather than withdrawn. So beautiful words. And I really encourage you to read Anne Alvarez, because that sentence summarizes, I think, her paper. So what we're talking about is this psychoanalytic theory of defensive withdrawal versus despairing and giving up. And this distinction is, I think, really important. So withdrawal is defensive. It's an active thing. It has meaning. It's often used for protection. I think that's what we used to interpret. But Anne Alvarez is saying giving up is very different to that. Giving up is a despair, an internal collapse, like a psychological death, she talks about, an absence of hope. So, and that requires a completely different analyst or play therapist in the room. And that's, the gift she's trying to give us. She referred to her arguments with Betty Joseph on an Italian beach, where Betty Joseph believed the patient projected their vitality into the analyst. Therefore, the analyst felt alive because the patient had deposited their living parts into the analyst. But I think a lot of us who've been in the room with the type of Anne Alvarez clients that she's talking about, it's not that feeling at all. There isn't much vitality left at all. Instead, there's sort of alarm or fear of a psychic death. So the concept that then came in from Anne was a dead internal object. So traditional Kleinian theory assumes that internal objects remain alive. Even if they're persecutory, they're still alive. While Anne Alvarez is proposing something much darker and scarier, which is that sometimes an internal object itself is dead. And not simply bad, it's dead. And I think that should change how we work with these kids. So she then talks about this seminal moment in her therapy with Robbie, where instead of being neutral, she becomes a different therapist. She goes, Robbie, hey, hi. Probably not like that, but she's saying she moved into his visual field, she called his name, and she emotionally reached towards him rather than sitting and interpreting. So she actively summons this boy, and she calls this the reclamation, no interpretation. So calling someone back into existence. So I'm just going to give you a little clinical example. I had a 4-year-old autistic girl who could barely stay in the room with me. She would come in with her mum and then just hide under blankets for months. But slowly the blanket would sort of like move. That'd be like that, and I was watching the blanket like a baby observation, and I'd say, oh, the blankets move. There's someone alive under there. So I was working very observationally and slowly helping this girl emerge from under the blanket. And it's really minute things that you're looking out for. So coming back to Anne Alvarez's talk last night, she presented Robbie had a stocking dream of a long stocking that goes deep into a well and rescues Robbie and his loved ones. And Alvarez was seeing this as the therapeutic relationship becoming a lifeline. And I believe it does. And I believe that's where our work is so vital with these kids. And I just felt that there were so many people in that lecture, 104 people, but no one asked a question. And we more talked about the mothers, the adult clients, but we couldn't bear to talk about how difficult this work is and how at times intuitive this work is in the clinical room. And that's why I'm doing this, because I feel I want to start a dialogue and I want to help people understand what the lecture was about from my point of view. So the other thing she really looked at, and I'm glad Anne did, was trauma. So obviously you can have autism, but then trauma on top of it. So, authors like Sue Reed pose that autistic children can become further traumatized. And she really made some interesting comments from me there. She talked about Bill Singletary, who argues that many autistic infants begin life already traumatized. And that was, my ears pricked up. So if this is a theory that really maybe intrauterine, these unborn babies are traumatized in some way, how can we research this? We need to keep this in mind. Again, it brings me back to the girl under the blanket. When she was born, she was just screaming. And the parents went to the pediatrician, an elderly pediatrician. He said, I've seen these babies before. Wrap her up, swaddle her, keep her in a dark room for at least 2 weeks and don't go out. And I thought that's an interesting advice from a pediatrician. But I think he was sort of trying to say this infant is totally overwhelmed and we need to just, down-regulate this infant and see how we can help the infant and enter this world much more slowly. So I thought that sounds like a good pediatrician. The other interesting thing that I liked in Anne's talk last night was we've got the flight, fright, freeze, and she talked about the flop as a fourth response to trauma. Hypoarousal, complete submission, and complete psychological collapse. And I'm glad that she sort of referenced Ogden and a lot of the sort of more attachment researchers. And I was glad to hear about Ellen Shaw's research being incorporated about the right to right brain. So that was really clever, I thought, from Anne. So then we've got the famous sort of John Steiner psychic retreat principle. And Anne was sort of saying it's not that. And she was talking about empty states. So again, Anne is I think very amazing in that she's saying, let's think about these psychic retreats, because she thinks there's a psychic desert. So what's a psychic retreat? It's viewed as something organized, defended, and inhabited. While Anne Alvarez's psychic desert is really, and I hope I'm saying this right, Anne, if you see this, you're welcome to criticize everything I say, because I don't want to misread you or interpret you, but this is the sense I made of a psychic desert, that it's about emptiness, it's undeveloped, and it's lifeless. So that they're two very different phenomena. And then we had the theme of deficit versus conflict, major controversy, obviously, and classical psychoanalysis assumes conflict, while the American self-psychology sort of movement were more or had deficit in mind. And I think Anne was trying to bridge that. So I think Anne was saying, instead of saying something is damaged, she was saying perhaps something never fully developed. So she referred to under-integration instead of the word deficit. But can you see how Anne Alvarez really places her theory in a developmental context, which I also really like? Then a big topic was countertransference last night. So the traditional view is that countertransference is our response as a therapist to these projections. While Anne Alvarez is saying sometimes countertransference is a recognition of genuine deadness. Really important, genuine deadness. So the analyst then has to fine-tune their observational skills into mood signs, like the finger under the blanket, the tone, and the person may not yet be able to project, is I think what she's saying. But I think the most memorable idea was also this wandering disability. And let me explain that. So in her paper last night, she was saying these children don't have learning difficulties. They have wandering disabilities. I thought that was so lovely. So they can't be curious, that they cannot become curious yet. So from no curiosity, no explanation, no thinking, no learning. And she linked that directly to Beyonce K. Very clever. Then she talked about Graham Music's paper Neglect from 2009. And Graham Music argued that neglect creates emptiness rather than terror. So neglect creates emptiness rather than terror. So then the countertransference becomes boredom, bleakness, deadness. So Graham's technique was describing tiny bodily movements like I did with the girl under the blanket, notice things, squirming jiggles. The girl from the finger below the blanket, it would poke out, then a hand would poke out. So you need to do like chanting, like talking out loud, any of these small signs of existence. And a lot of the therapy starts like that. And I think it helps the patient realize I exist. So it's very different to making sort of an interpretation about their relationship with me. Like it's really pulling the client into existence. Lorraine Rose, who sadly passed, used to talk about that it's our job as a therapist to help and pull a lot of clients into the work. So then we talked about, important concepts like the void, the black holes, the formlessness, the absence of psychic representation. And I think all these states challenge psychoanalysis because they all may lack symbolic meaning. And we're very much about using symbolic meaning. So Anne Alvarez mentioned Joshua Durbin, and he introduced a concept of anxiety of being. So he's saying before we have persecutory anxiety, there may be a different anxiety, which is called a fear of disappearing. So again, we had a long talk last night that behind the bad object may lie no object at all. And Anne finds this enormously important. So let's come to technique, because I think a lot of us were there last night. to learn from the master. What do we do with these children in the room that are so hard to work with? And I think actually that's why we didn't talk about openly of how hard it is to work with these children in case we look dumb or scared or like a psychoanalyst. So the paper was basically saying instead of containment alone, you have to do more. You have to do, firstly, vitalizing, calling the patient back into life. It's a reclamation, helping the lost self return, amplifying, so any of the signs of life, like the finger under the blanket, highlight those signs of life, insisting on meaning, that all behavior has meaning. And sometimes you have to create that meaning. And she, said, use vivid images, use describing, don't over-interpret. And I so agree with that. So she talked about a case, Robert. So instead of, I think there was a holiday coming and he brought some Lego into the session because of the holiday. And the therapist, instead of saying you brought Lego because of the holiday, like an interpretation that increases anxiety. And Melanie Klein always said, interpret the anxiety because internally the client is going to get the greatest relief. However, Anne Alvarez is saying, interpret the need. Don't increase the anxiety. So the therapist should instead say, anyone would feel before a holiday that the therapist shouldn't leave them. How am I going to get through the holiday? I need my therapist to be there for me. So validating the legitimate need, not going for pathology, not interpreting the anxiety, but interpreting the need, which is very different. It's a different technique. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. Talking about introjection, that was also quite fascinating. And Anne argued that introjection isn't simply taking in a good object. It actually requires a capacity to notice, to hold, to savor, to remember, to return to value. And all these positive experiences must become durable. And I think that is what we do with the kids we see that are so disturbed and in so much need of our help and not of us giving up. So what Anne Alvarez was saying is that positive experience in the room creates thought. And that's perhaps, I think, the biggest theoretical innovation of how to work with these kids. Like Freud was saying, thinking comes from frustration. Bion was saying thinking develops because frustration forces thought. But Alvarez says, yes, but positive experiences also stimulate thinking, surprise, interest, delight, curiosity, wonder. All those generate thought. So she connects curiosity with Bion's K and the neurodivergent sort of kids that we describe. So she is very widely read. She quoted Daniel Stern, Trevathan, Beatrice Beebe, Ellen Shaw. I'm very happy about that because sometimes psychoanalysis just didn't want to look at this stuff. But I'm so pleased that the Australian Psychoanalytic Institute invited Anne Alvarez to talk. I was just so pleased. That's why I was there. So, we're bringing in the dopamine firing with like the mother talking to the infant, that a relationship is established. It's not just comfort, it's curiosity, thinking, interaction. So the final clinical sort of message was that the analyst sometimes becomes less the observer or interpreter, and we actually become a developmental object. And I actually agree that that's what happens in the room. So we, the therapists, provide interest, vitality, curiosity, emotional aliveness. And that has to be internalized by the client. So instead of just sitting there and interpreting unconscious meaning, the analyst might have to first help create a mind that is capable of having meaning. And that's the hard work. This is taking longer than I thought. Her 1.5 hour lecture is turning into more than 20 minutes. So I guess I just really want to get across the biggest shift that Anne Alvarez is sort of putting in front of us, which is that we have to go from interpreting conflict to actually facilitating development. So that some patients can't benefit from the classical interpretations because there's insufficient psychic structure for them. So if a client would go, what unconscious fantasy is this behavior expressing? I think Alvarez would be asking, what developmental capacity is missing here? And that's the profound shift. So rather than viewing the child primarily through conflict, she asks about developmental arrest, but internal developmental arrest. So rather than asking, what does this symbolize? She asks, what capacity has never properly developed inside this child? I don't think she's abandoning psychoanalysis. I think she's expanding it. But I think some people might say it's not psychoanalytic. And I think this is why I'm so pleased the psychoanalysts are thinking about this. So let me just get my notes sorted. This is my first time ever trying to do a blog, so you have to bear with me. So Anne Alvarez changes the role of countertransference, how we use it. So in Kleinian thinking, countertransference sees the patient as projecting, the therapist experiences it. Alvarez, I think, says there's another possibility here, that sometimes countertransference is more like recognition. So the therapist detects the emptiness, the collapse, the lack of vitality, not because it's been projected, but because it genuinely exists. So that's a radical departure from the strict projective identification models that we've learned from Klein. And that's why she says the analyst has to become more active and be life company. And that's where the title Reclaiming Psychic Life, I think, comes from. I do want to also come back to this, I think, really important point that I think we as the therapist are a developmental object for these children. And that is really functioning like an early caregiver. So we're not just interpreting, I think we're building capacity inside the child we have in therapy. So we're helping the patient notice, we're helping them remember, we're helping them, from week to week to remember what we're working on. They're having a positive experience of someone keeping them in mind. And like Anne is quite clear that good experiences alone are not sufficient. So now she goes into sort of a meta perspective, is that we have to help the child think about that good experience. And those good experiences have to become thinkable. So that's, we're talking about mentalization. So the curiosity that she wants to bring alive inside the child is also a favorite idea of mine that she has, because they lack this wondering, and she calls it a wondering disability, which is a beautiful phrase. So that the children may fail to learn, not because they're unintelligent, but because nothing feels worth wondering about. No mystery, no anticipation, no attraction. And this links directly she links it to Beyonce. So she talked about the patient becomes interested in our interest. So this is a subtle phrase, but it's really an important developmental observation. So recovery does not begin with, I like my therapist. It begins with, I notice someone else is interested in me. Interest itself becomes interesting. And only later do you get the deep curiosity. And I think she also reframes introjection. That classically introjection means taking in the good object, but I think Anne Alvarez is saying it's much more complicated than that. It's not straightforward, because the clients, these little people, have to gradually learn to notice their experiences, to be able to stay with them, to savor them, to remember them, to return to them, to value them. They're all developmental achievements. So I think she's almost describing, how alpha function develops. So I'm just going to say that I think no one was willing to admit how hard this work is. So I'm going to admit a recent case. I had an 8-year-old boy. I have a play therapy room. It obviously has a window. It has a sink. In the first session, it was hard for this boy to separate. In the first session, in my assessment of him room, which was different to the play therapy room, he turned my coffee table upside down, took all the sticky tape he could, wrapped it all around, emptied it, then put himself under it and over it. So this is the sort of non-verbal boy, but really trying to hold himself together. So I decided to take him on work long term. Probably had 13 sessions. Session number 2 in the wet play therapy room. He sees the sink. I go, he's going to the sink. I'm just observing. He opens the window and jumps out. In 40 years of working, I've never had a child jump out of a window. So I just want to put that out there. It happens to all of us. I run around the building, get to the courtyard. I have not been able to get him back into that room, but he loves being in our courtyard where we have a veggie patch, edible landscapes, and I've been adjusting. The only times he talks to me is about the vegetables, what he can eat, what he can't eat, the bananas, when will they be ripe. But I'm slowly building my relationship with him, but it's outside, and I don't know when I'm going to get him back into that room. But I actually feel the garden represents growth, how to fertilize, how to water. Things take time to mature, to ripen. I'm just using it all as a play that is symbolic of what I'm trying to do with him. And this is where Peter Blake, my supervisor here in Sydney, used to say, if you speak to the child too directly, it's too confronting. You need a third space, be it the toy figure, you talk for that. I'm using the garden with this boy. That I'm thinking, I don't know what Anne Alvarez would say to this, but I think it's that sometimes our technique has to follow what the child can cope with rather than how we want to work. So I think, Alvarez is working with a really tricky population, and the 104 people that were there last night probably are too. And I think we need to help each other to share ideas. the other point that she also made is that often these children feel really ashamed of their dependency. And I think I agree with her that sometimes with really traumatized or neglected children, the therapist can communicate with the child and comment that they should have been cared for, and notice the difference when they're growing. And anyone needs a mum and dad, so that we also sort of help with this emotional reparation. So that the minimal classic psychoanalytic interpretation is sort of where I'm headed with this. And I think Anne and Peter Blake have talked about this too. But I think insight has to be pre-digested, especially with these really damaged children. And too much interpretation of the relationship is indigestible. And I think one shouldn't do it, basically. So the analyst metabolizes first, the child metabolizes second, and you got to choose the small amounts you hand back. So the positive experience with the therapist can produce thinking. And that is Anne Alvarez's, I think, greatest theoretical innovation, that she says the pleasure can create thinking too, and she argues that surprise and interest and beauty and all of that being understood by the therapist, being remembered, being delighted in, all stimulate thought. So don't give up. So neuroscience is joining psychoanalysis. So I guess instead of asking what unconscious meaning is this play expressing when you're writing your sessions, I think Alvarez invites us to ask, is the child discovering curiosity? Can they sustain interest in something? My boy can sustain interest in the veggie patch, but not inside the therapy room. Can they notice enjoyment? My case can't, but the boy can't. Can they remain with pleasure? The boy I'm seeing, not yet. Can they remember yesterday's play? Yes, he can. Is the bananas ripe? Have they gone yellow? He can. Can the child build on yesterday's play? Yes, and that this 8-year-old boy has learned that veggies need water. He knows how to check if they should be watered. Can they imagine future sessions? Yes, he can. He says the bananas he's harvested and put in the shed, he says no one else should eat them. I'll come and check on them. I said, absolutely. They've got your name on it. They're your bananas. Can they hold me in mind during absence? I'm not sure yet because it's early days with the boy. I think he can hold the fruit, the harvest in mind, and his experience of being in the garden in mind. But I am still trying to form a relationship, a trusting relationship with this boy. So I'm looking for developmental markers in the work rather than, or not exclusive, like rather than just symbolic interpretations. They will come much later. So I'm hoping this makes sense. So the important thing of symbol formation. This is what Anne Alvarez says. First, someone notices me. Then I notice being noticed. And then I begin noticing myself. And then I begin wondering. And then, only then, I begin thinking. And then symbolic play develops. These kids don't walk in with the capacity for symbolic play. And it takes many years sometimes to get there. So I think Anne Alvarez beautifully backs up in some way Klein and Beyond. So her distinction between giving up and the defensive withdrawal is interesting with her argument with, I think, us, Esther Vick or Betty Joseph. I think maybe those two things can overlap. I don't think it has to be either or. A child might begin with a defensive withdrawal and then over years of chronic neglect or failed relationships, they arrive at profound resignation. So a therapist might also experience a deadness that may arise partly from projective identification, but also partly from the patient's actual psychological collapse. So I think there's an interaction between the two. We don't have to throw one out. They're not mutually exclusive explanations. So I think as clinicians, we gotta hold them together. So I think, is the play we do with the kids expressing conflict, or is it building capacity that were never fully developed? And I think Anne Alvarez allows us to help build this capacity that needs to be part of our formulations of these kids. And I think that's what last night was about. So, sorry it took so long, but I just want to help translate what was a very dense presentation to the younger therapists, the new psychoanalytic therapists that want to understand but might have felt really bamboozled. So I hope I've put it into plain language. This is my first take on ever doing something like that. If you like it, let me know. I might do more of them.